Number of things that I wanted to cover off here on the live stream. Quite a bit going on in the heavyweight division. This is one of the first weekends of the year, really, because we haven't really had too much to write home about. One of the first weekends of the year we've got a bit to sort of sink our teeth into. A decent card with a couple of heavyweight fights on it. Dillian Whtte versus Alexander Povetkin, and also Shawndale Winters versus Alan Babbage. Both fights interesting for different reasons, and we'll come to some of the press conference, the beef between Babbage and Winters, which, you know, it was already a decent fight. It's one of these things that's got zero divisional relevance, that fight. But it's interesting because it's a decent step up for Babbage after just a few fights. Whereas, you know, the press conference added that little bit of extra spice to it. So we'll come to that. A few thoughts. Obviously, the main event, there seems to be a bit of a push around, it's certainly from what I've seen, that people believe that Alexander Povetkin is more than just a live dog. Many people picking him to win. So we've got Mackenzie Daly betting tips in the building there. Unrivaled boxing talk and news with a super chat. Thank you for that. He says Winters might knock Babbage TF out. So I won't expand on the TF, but we get what you mean there. So welcome one and all. 17 in the chat. Punch Quote says, did Dubois first opponent test positive? So I will get to that as well, because I've got a number of things on my list, and I'll just quickly whip through that, but I'll just respond to Unrivaled's super chat comment there. It's an interesting fight. I already thought, you know, this is actually a pretty decent step up, and under normal circumstances, you probably wouldn't see this fight made. But because it is a pay-per-view card, there's an expectation you're going to have better fights on there. They had to go with a stronger opponent than Babbage might have otherwise got. So, yeah, this is a good test, and we've seen with Shawndale Winters, if you're not good enough, or you start to gas, he can take advantage and take you out, like he did Alexander Teslenko. There was also another prospect he stopped in Poland last year. So we saw in the Parker fight, he's got some decent skills, but at a certain level, obviously, his ability sort of caps out, and Parker ultimately stopped him in, what was it, 5 rounds, something like that. But he put up a reasonably credible effort there. So Glenn Avery says, morning from Orlando, Florida. Stefan says, hello from Australia. So all over the world, sort of a multicultural or multi-continental flavour with the chat here. So welcome one and all. 17 in the building at this point. I'm sort of starting a little bit earlier, should I say, than I otherwise would. I actually just woke up from a 3-hour nap. I've been sort of smashed about by hay fever this week. There's like mass amounts of pollen that have been sort of blowing into sort of the area where I live, and it's been knocking me about a bit. So had a decent nap, and I was ready to roll, and I thought I'll get into it. But some of the topics that I wanted to cover, so as I mentioned at the top, so obviously the card this weekend, a couple of heavyweight fights that are on it. And I'll just bring up my notes here. I thought I had them open, but I just have to bring them up. Bear with me for a second. So the topics list that I had, okay. This is quite painful getting to it. Apologies for this. Okay, so Daniel Dubois, his new opponent, so Ricardo Schneider's. Eric Pfeffer is not happy. He's put out a post on social media saying he's going to be talking, and he's definitely not happy. And his promoter, and I've got some of the quotes here, which I'll read through soon, basically saying that it's BS that that fight has been cancelled. Also, the Parker Farr talks, they're making progress. Did a video with David Higgins, or an interview, should I say, earlier this week. Another topic which I thought was going to be a bit of an interesting back and forth, and one that I definitely want some comments and some thoughts on from you guys, is that the WBC appoint Tony Bellew to the committee that is looking at a potential new division between 200 and 225 pounds. Myself, I'm not down with this sort of, adding of another division. I just think it's laughable, but we'll come to it. Christian Thun, he's back in October, as is Timothy Moten. Jagba back in September. We'll sort of touch on this. There's a couple of other fights on this weekend, but relatively speaking, the schedule's pretty clear this weekend. You've got the Povetkin Whtte fight with the undercard fight of Babbage Winters, but not too much elsewhere. But there is the return of Juan Pablo Hernandez versus Kevin Johnson, or sort of Johan Pablo Hernandez, I should say. Also a Russian prospect, Arslan Aliev. He will be fighting for the WBC youth title, but we'll come to that. So I'll just get back to the chat. So Sir Oko says, morning from the UK. Jambo Brown, why did Frank Warren really change Daniel Dubois' opponent? Question mark. UK. Philip Crew, hello from West Yorkshire, England. Unrivaled says, all right, morning from Ireland. So we've got a real multi-continental flavour going here on the chat. Jack Johnson says, night from Auckland. Jambo says, good morning, Mark. Cash Cow, look out, hey people. Oh, and Unrivaled Boxing Talk and News, if you don't already know, he has a channel of his own, so do subscribe. Very good in-depth knowledge of the sport, especially in the historical sort of context too, which compared to a lot of other channels on the internet, not many others have a sort of thorough in-depth knowledge going back way back when than Mark does. So Cash Cow says, look out, hey people. He says, hey, my lockdown buddies in New Zealand, regards from Melbourne, Australia. Well, we're kind of not in a lockdown. I mean, Auckland is on alert level 3, which is kind of a lockdown, but kind of not. They can still get takeaways and work, etc. Whereas the rest of the country, it's at what's called level 2, which kind of means, wear a mask and just social distance, all that sort of stuff. Unrivaled Boxing Talk and News says we should remove divisions, not add more. Yep, I agree with that, but we'll come to that. So this issue with Daniel Dubois, you have the opponent being changed from Eric Pfeiffer. I always want to say Pfeffer because I had an art teacher, same spelling. She pronounced it Pfeffer, but apparently it's pronounced Pfeiffer. But some comments by EC Boxing promoter Errol Seelan. He is going in on Frank Warren and the Queensbury stable, basically saying what's happened here, all this sort of stuff you're talking about. We didn't submit stuff, it's just a crock. We put everything through that we did. We never heard back. And when we put through some correspondence to get the contract done, you didn't get back to us. So I'll get to the actual direct quotes because it does seem that there's more going on than sort of meets the surface. Because when it sort of came out with the press release saying that there was a scan or something that wasn't submitted, and it was a few people saying maybe it was the wrong scan, that was something that wasn't accepted in the UK. It did sort of seem, given it was basically at the time about 10 days out, something like that, couldn't they just have quickly done another scan and within 24 hours got the requisite details via the internet, an email or something like that to them to make sure that they could go ahead with the fight? It seemed a little bit thin to me, but certainly Errol Seelan, talking to Boxing Scene, says these guys are not to be respected. They claim there was an issue with paperwork. That's bull. We submitted all the medical documents in time, but never heard back from anyone from Warren's team. We asked for the contract, never heard back for days from anyone. Now, Eric's training camp is completely wasted because of these ash holes. They are all untrustworthy. Frank Warren, his son, all of them. I will never again do business with these people. Everything will need to be signed in writing. I'm a man of my word. I make deals and work hard to carry my reputation as a man of, in the beginning, we arranged for both fights. I was more unsure. I must have sort of pasted together 2 paragraphs there because that didn't completely run on clean, did it? But he says, in the beginning, we arranged for both fights. I was more unsure that the Wallish fight would happen. We didn't have all his paperwork, and he wasn't in the best shape taking the fight on short notice. They said everything was fine because they knew he wasn't going to beat Joe Joyce. But we were confident that Eric was going to beat Dubois. He is in the best shape of his career. He is still sparring. We didn't know how to tell him there is no fight. They knew he was going to beat Dubois and ruin their plans for a fight between Dubois and Joe Joyce. That's why they never answered when I kept calling and texting them. They are scared. They are all pussies. These people are ash holes. They are not to be trusted. And next time I see them, they will feel it. So Errol Seelan, War Seelan, sort of going off there on Frank Warren, Queensbury, his son there as well, Francis Warren. So, I mean, this whole thing is kind of bizarre because when it sort of surfaced that they were going to bring in Ricardo Snijders, I just thought, this is terrible. But then you had the sort of explanation there was a medical issue, which apparently was not submitting some paperwork. But then you have the complete sort of, oh, hang on, you're not quite actually telling us the truth here, from Errol Seelan saying, we gave you the paperwork and you never got back to us. You never got back to us signing the contract. So it just adds another layer of dimension and intrigue. But also, what was because for some, this will look like just some sort of bait and switch, that they never intended to fight Pfeiffer and that they were just going to bring in this guy, Snyders. But the thing is, though, this is such a terrible main event. If you were BT, I'm sure you wouldn't be happy with this because, Daniel Dubois has fought a number of these types of opponents. And it starts to raise the question, is there an issue with Daniel Dubois? Are they protecting him? Because, we've already seen the likes of Fujimoto and Ebenezer Tete, which were complete waste of space type fights. And this is another waste of space type fights. And I know that some people, especially in the comments section to the video that I did the other day, or yesterday or whatever it was, said, what do you expect at 10 days notice? But people need to factor into this. This wasn't arranged at 10 days notice. This guy was lined up weeks ago, and that is in the press release that they put out. So I'm not buying the whole, well, this is no one's fault but, Eric Pfeiffer's team, all that's Pfeiffer's team. This is actually, they could have arranged a better opponent as a backup for Daniel Dubois. Probably just speculation that the reason that they didn't was because money, because they'd probably have to be paying someone to be training, etc. So go on the cheap there. But with all the sort of cloak and dagger sort of behavior here, it sort of seems, like it's looking like a deliberate bait and switch. And the fact that there was still 10 days or so until the fight, and they pulled the pin on it. But Errol Seelan is saying, look, we provided the paperwork. You guys never got back to us. So if there was an issue, you would think they would be chasing them up for it, not just all of a sudden pulling the pin. But maybe there is something else more going on here. Some will say that maybe Daniel Dubois is being protected, that they thought that Pfeiffer was going to beat him. Personally, I think that it was an appropriate sort of fight for him to take at this stage because, at least on the surface, there was some mystery. I think most of us still expected Daniel Dubois to get through this, but maybe he would be tested. And after all, isn't that what he needs at this point? He's not 2-0 anymore. He actually needs to go some rounds. We actually need to see him tested in certain areas. Really, I don't think we've found out how good his chin is, but certain other things. How is his development going? We know that he's got some decent fundamentals. That was clear to see in the Gorman fight. But he hasn't pushed on from there. It's basically he's been fighting silhouettes for the past year. So, the whole thing is bizarre. Okay, I'll get back up to the chat here. We'll see where we were. So, Daniel females a tasty snack treat. Wells, interesting name there, says the WBC trying to throw Wilder a bone and make him a champion again after he gets whipped again. Are you talking about that 200 to 225 division? We'll come to that a bit later, because I think, that's a division. I don't want to see any more created. The WBC, the WBA, they're like in competition at the moment, sort of a race to the bottom. Bacon and Egg says, hey mate, how you been? Not too bad. This week a little bit of hay fever, lots of sort of pine pollen been blowing into the area that I live, sort of getting a little bit knocked around, but okay. So Common Sense says, good morning from London, good morning to you, or good evening as it is from my end. Fish says, all right fellas, Dillian did a great interview with Teddy Atlas. Okay, I haven't seen it. I may check it out if I get time. Jack says they're close to getting the deal done and Higgins rushed to social media to make him look bad or something like that. Okay, we'll come to Joseph Parker and Junior Farr a little bit later on. It was interesting because Lou DiBella was actually saying, look, David Higgins, don't go talking to the media, stay off social media, let's keep negotiating. And then he did the interview with me like some hours after DiBella had actually put that out. So, and obviously as part of that interview, he did sort of say that Farr and his team were being greedy. But that's, David Higgins all over. He's always going to sort of never sort of shrink away from telling you what he thinks. So Cash Cow says, I thought Whtte made the right decision waiting around for the WBC belt. What do you reckon? Personally, no. I mean, he had the opportunity to fight over a year ago. It's almost 18 months ago, for 3 major recognized belts. I think that was a major error. I think greed got in the way there. That's my personal opinion. I mean, I know that there are some people around saying that Whyte's been hard done by and hasn't had opportunities and has been made to wait. But he's turned down opportunities too. And, a shot at 3 belts, I think that would have been the smart move. But, haggling over money for a rematch split, ultimately he decided that he would go another way. Jambo says, I wouldn't put it past Higgins. Jody says, good morning from a very hot and sunny Belgium. Looking forward to Saturday when Delphine Persoon will finally get justice. For me, the main event is the icing on the cake. Well, I thought Persoon won that fight a year ago. I mean, I wouldn't use the term robbery, but I thought that she did win that. I thought at the very worst it could have been a draw, but I think it was either 6-4 or 7-3 on my card. 6-4, I think, from memory. It's sort of hard, but I thought she won the fight. Jambo says, I think Warren is being shady and cheap. Well, possible, but, this whole thing about this, replacement opponent, what is it? Why are all this cloak and dagger stuff? Was it always the intention to have this guy as the opponent? I mean, it makes sense in these times with Corona to be basically having a backup. I mean, we see that often for title fights and other, because in America they've had a few guys being on standby that they may be in another fight, but they'll be elevated to the main event or co-main event if someone comes down with COVID. But this situation, it goes from a fight where it was still considered by most a tune-up. It was a guy in Eric Pfeiffer that was 7-0, still largely unknown, untested, unheralded as a prospect. But you got to say, this has been like the best thing ever for Eric Pfeiffer in terms of his profile. And he hasn't had to sort of lift a finger or do anything, really. And now that with the pullout, people are going to sort of think, well, is this guy really, really good? I mean, I think the answer is probably going to be somewhere in the middle, that he's a decent fighter. And it probably would have been an okay test for Daniel Dubois, but I think Dubois probably still would have won. So really what's going on? I mean, I'm sure Errol Seelan and Frank Warren, they're probably holding back a little something that they're probably never going to put out in public. But certainly Errol Seelan of EC Boxing, who promotes Eric Pfeiffer, not happy. So, yeah. So Fish says Warren snide ASF, simples. Jack Johnson says ash holes. Yeah, I was trying to just sort of say that to get around the use of the other word. Fight Night Productions says he agrees. The only reason he made the poster is that he could keep his name being said and try to stay afloat. But as soon as he is comfortable again, he will go back to the same mismatches. I'm not sure which fighter you're talking about there. Ruben says, what do you think of Whyte bringing in Coldwell days before the fight? Does it show uncertainty from Whyte and not fully trusting in Xavier Miller? No, I don't think so. I mean, he was going to have a second man in the corner anyway. I think that they just wanted to go in here with someone with a bit more experience, who's been probably also the fight camp environment too. That probably helps. I did see a few people sort of saying Coldwell was a bad choice because he couldn't come up with a plan to beat Alexander Usyk, but that made no sense to me because Alexander Usyk at cruiserweight, no one came up with a plan to get rid of him. But yeah, I think remembering that with Mark Tibbs and Dillian Whyte in the setup that they had, they also had certain people as part of the sort of Tibbs extended family and, gym situation that were helping out with that setup. So Whyte's basically coming in with not just the new trainer, he needed a new corner entirely. So, I mean, I think it's okay. Second pair of eyes, experienced guy. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, let's face it, Dave Coldwell's probably going to get paid pretty well for, a few days' work, a week's work. So Fish says it was Xavier's idea, shows wisdom, I think. Well, and for him to sort of say, let's bring this guy in, they must have had some sort of relationship before, maybe gelled and thought that this is going to be a good fit for the corner, second pair of eyes. And Ruben says, okay, yeah, fair, more eyes and all that. So Organic Fitness with the super chat, appreciate that. And it's got two emojis. One's the fire and, it was at the fist explosion and then the fire emoji. So thank you for that. Fight Night says, I think it would do everyone better in the long term if Warren sunk because he's doing it for the fans, but I don't believe that without him there will be less obstruction and more fights. See, I think you can look at that sort of scenario and that sort of thinking in a couple of different ways, because if he sinks, then there's less competition, so then there's more of a monopoly for the main player, which would be Matchroom, which I think reduces competition. I mean, for me, I think it's better if Frank Warren does well, because when there's healthy competition, that's better for the fighters, in my view, in terms of their purses, conditions, all that sort of thing. Spaghetti Leg says he likes Dubois, but he's being built like a hype job. Mentioning Whtte as an opponent is a joke. Well, certainly after it sort of falls off from Pfeiffer down to Ricardo Schneider's, which is, it's a terrible main event. If I was BT, I wouldn't be happy. And they've had pretty, woeful sort of viewership figures. I mean, across the board, all over the world with some of the boxing events, there hasn't been great viewership. But BT, would have been hoping that at Daniel Dubois, which is they're sort of pinning with the Frank Warren stable, that he's going to be one of these guys that's going to be a big star in the future. Having in these sorts of fights does nothing for Dubois, but it does nothing for BT either. And you're sort of right there. He's being built like a hype job in the sense that he's got so many of these opponents. After the Gorman fight, I think there was optimism with such a good performance, and he got a lot of sort of attention as a result of that he was going to kick on and start sort of climbing through the levels. But then it sort of devolves back to guys like Fujimoto, etc., and now Ricardo Schneider's. I mean, I don't think all of us were that happy when it was Eric Pfeiffer was announced, and also in terms of Joe Joyce, having these interim opponents. But I understand why they did it. Activity, and in case the fight was, because originally they were going to be having the fight with Joyce in April, then it was July, so it kept getting pushed out. So the interim opponents did make some sense for activity. But how much activity Dubois gets from facing a guy like Snyder's, who Frank Warren is trying to say is going to be a solid test. I mean, it's laughable just having actually putting that down, that, in writing, that it's a solid test. I mean, it is a joke, that is, it's hard to sort of explain how bad a joke that is. So Daniel says, how tall are you? 6 foot. Bacon and Egg says he's only young. That's of Daniel Dubois. He is, but there is a case to say that they're not building him, the way that sort of you would expect him to at this stage, that he should be kicking on. And it looked like they were sort of building him in a certain way, but it's just really tapered off. And the fact that this Eric Pfeiffer has this fight's fallen over for whatever reason, we've been dispute on either side now about the real reason. It makes you wonder: are they? I mean, it gets those sort of those speculative comments about, are they protecting him? Is there something wrong? Did they really have to pull this because they were worried about some aspect? There's the vacuum of information. I mean, from all outside looking in, it looks like he's ready for bigger and better fights, and he needs guys to be taking him rounds. And what's the point in bringing in guys like Snyder's? I mean, if it had been a Razvan Kajanu type, that that sort of level, potential to take him some rounds, I wouldn't have an issue. But at the moment, because this guy's a cruiserweight, he's only had a couple of fights at heavyweight overall in his career. Most recently one fight, and before that he was down competing at cruiserweight at a pretty pedestrian level. So this does nothing for him. So Jambo says, I think BT Sports viewership numbers will be severely impacted by this. Yeah, potentially. I mean, and the thing is, with this, I mean, someone made a really good comment that I thought was very accurate. They said, basically, Dubois is getting paid for a training session. And I thought, that is so true. Cash Cow says, Dubois calling out Whtte is a distraction tactic, 100%. Well, I don't think it's so much of a distraction tactic. White's got a fight coming up. Connect Dubois' name to Whtte. He gets some attention. I mean, that's what they're looking to do. And Dubois has his own fight coming up that barely no one was talking about until the sort of bait and switch with the opponents, which, I don't think the people are very impressed with. And Fish says, what, another division? Yeah. So they're looking, the WBC at their convention There was a remit or something like that was proposed of a weight class between 200 and 225. So I'm falling behind on the chat here, so we will endeavour to catch up. So Zlubak says, Kia ora Boxing Squared, how's it down under? Well, it's been a bit wet this week, but there's been a lot of pollen blowing around, so I've had a bit of hay fever, and that's been knocking me about. It's one of these things. As a kid, I never had hay fever, but as an adult, I've started to get it. I sort of thought that's a bit weird. So Jody says, congrats on your informative and unbiased yet also really entertaining channel. That is a hard to find combination these days. Well, I appreciate that feedback, Jody. Spaghetti says, I think Warren is struggling massively for money. He filed for bankruptcy last year. Dubois versus Joyce and Fury versus Wilder is the only income he's going to make this year. He needs to hype Dubois versus Joyce. Well, I would sort of say, I don't know why this sort of fight has fallen off, but I don't think Eric Pfeiffer, and let's face it, Mikael Walsh for Joe Joyce, they weren't expensive opponents. They weren't. You think that Mikael Walsh, for some of the disclosed purses that he's had for like F.A. Ajagba when he fought him last year, he got $20,000 US. So I would imagine that it's there or thereabouts in terms of what he's got for Yoka and also got for the Joyce fight. And I don't think Pfeiffer would have got much, these aren't expensive opponents. So if it was a case of money, it sort of doesn't make sense. Yeah, it really is quite quizzical how this fight has fallen over. Ruben says, did Whtte take step aside from the WBC? He's waiting 1,000 days, and that's 3 times more than the WBC weight rule. It's weird that as soon as he pursued legal action, the WBC granted him immediate shot after Wilder Fury 3. So, no, there's a few things with that 1,000 days narrative that, people who push that barrow sort of forget. Because he was made the number 1. This is at the end of 2017, in November. But Dominic Breazeale was made the mandatory. So this whole, and that was in the fight on the card of Wilder Stavern. So Breazeale, he was due to face Stavern, but Stavern was elevated to the main fight after Ortiz popped for that test. So then in comes Eric Molina. But because there was a contract between Stavern and Breazeale, which was Breazeale fighting Stavern for the mandatory, that had to be kept for Breazeale versus Molina. And the WBC did a few different things on their website. It was said it was just an eliminator and then a final eliminator. But Dominic Breazeale actually pursued that with his own lawyers to make sure he was still, after that win, made the mandatory. So it's one of these things. Whtte wasn't the mandatory for 3 years, and people keep pushing that. There's a distinction. Being the number 1 doesn't mean the mandatory. You have to be named the mandatory. And as we know, Dominic Breazeale was made to wait as well for, what was it, the best part of a year and a half or something like that. So we can pile in on the WBC with its handling, but also we can sort of question why did they even put Eric Molina into that fight, even at short notice, because I believe he was like number 11 or something at the WBC rankings at the time. But the whole 1,000 days thing, and that's not quite accurate as well as number 1, because at the point that Whtte beat Rivas, he stopped being the number 1 contender in the division because he was elevated to being an interim champion because there was an interim title on the line. And let's not forget Whtte had opportunities elsewhere, but in terms of the WBC, he's really pushed his lot in with them. But in terms of the WBC making Wilder and etc. face a mandatory every 12 months, they haven't been strict on that. But Breazeale, he was made to wait for 18 months, and sure, we can question the validity of whether he deserved to be mandatory, bearing in mind he'd only had 1 or 2 fights to get into that position. But it is what it is. It's the sanctioning body. We can't sort of trust them to be fair and equal. Look at Berman Stavern having been made a mandatory. 1 fight in 2 years before he got sort of elevated, and he also got dropped in that fight against Derek Rossi. But that whole narrative of 1,000 days, some of that is also being sort of spun in a certain way with certain facts being omitted. And it's in the interest of Sky, for example, who recently, and I talked about this on Patreon, I know some Dillian Whtte fans get a bit sort of aggro about this when people poke holes in it. But that story that Sky did recently of the 1,000 days completely omitted some key facts and information that give you some key context and balance. So the whole 1,000-day crew pushing that thing, I mean, if you want to sort of look at it that way and ignore other facts, well, more power to you. But yeah, Dillian Whtte has had opportunities elsewhere, but the 1,000 days thing is a marketing tool at this point. Let's face it. And Sky, some of their coverage of this sort of stuff is not balanced. It's not even. Remembering they're making money from boxing, and some of the stuff that they do has been questionable at, to say the least. So Lubak says he edged Pursoon in the first fight. Yeah, I did too. Fight Night says he agrees with me. He's refused the IBF Eliminator with Pulev and could have pushed for the WBO belt too with the Eliminator. However, I think he's been screwed over by the WBC. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that the WBC hasn't done anything wrong to Whtte, because I thought at the point that they made Tyson Fury the mandatory, they were effectively punishing Dillian Whtte over the UCAD situation when that hadn't been resolved. So when it was resolved and Whtte was cleared, as it were, that had sort of fulfilled that they'd punished him when did they really have grounds to do so. They saw it as an opportunity to make a mandatory for Deontay Wilder, to make sure that he had another one within a year or whatever. It was convenient for them to do so, and Whtte was collateral damage in that situation. But he has chosen to go down that route with the WBC. He's done a number of different fights, and he held the silver title and ultimately beat Rivas to get the interim title. It was made a mandatory. They pushed it back for another year. So there has been times where he has been screwed over by the WBC. I'm not disputing that. But Dillian Whtte has also had a very carefully managed career. He has turned down eliminators and certain things like that, but it's been a very calculated move. He's thrown his lot in with the WBC, but also he's been the second guy at Matchroom, the second sort of Matchroom star on pay-per-view. He's taken a number of fights with the likes of Parker and Chisora over other fights he could have taken for money. And he's a prize fighter, so I get it. And I'm not slamming him for that, but it is what it is. The whole narrative that he's been ducked and avoided all over the place, it is completely overblown. And I know some people, get upset and get into their feelings when I, say these sorts of things, but that's my point of view. You don't have to agree with me, but there are certain facts that are often ignored in this sort of conversation regarding Dillian Whtte. But this fight and some of the other fights that he's had with Parker and Chisora, they've been good fights. In terms of divisional relevance, they're good fights, if either facing top 10 or top 20 guys. At the case that he fought, when he fought Oscar Rivas was sort of there or thereabouts in the top 15. Not in the top 10 as Dillian Whtte tried to tell us all, but, he's fought some decent competition. But it's been clear he's, carved a path that has optimized a narrative that he's being avoided in the WBC. At the same time, he's getting well paid for pay-per-view events in the UK. He's had a very well-managed, he's done very well for himself on the money side, but also he's built a good resume in the process. But we can't forget he has sort of, taken a certain route and ignored other fights. I think he would have been better off having a shot at Anthony Joshua back in April 2019 when that was offered to him. But it is what he is. But the whole that he's been screwed over and out of has been avoided completely. There's two sides to that story. Bacon and Egg says, who do you want to win out of Tim Tszyu and Jeff Horn? I'm not sure if there's a who do I want to win, but it's an interesting fight. It's, potentially a changing of the sort of guard type fight. Jeff Horn's been holding Australian boxing down for a few years. Tim Tszyu, obviously the son of Costa Tszyu, he's coming through. He's been progressing, looking better, but is it a step too far at this point? So, yeah, next Wednesday. That's crept up fast, but I'm hoping for a good fight. I think in Australia it's a pay-per-view for about $50. So Cash Cow says he agrees with the point of 3 belts, but chasing Wilder in big US fight was the right move. Also, Fury chasing Wilder potentially puts him in a Fury fight, who has a big USA management. Well, it is what it is at this point. Everyone's made their own decisions, and with the sort of passing of time, sort of the history of it is for their own purposes. They push their own narratives and sort of finesse what happened at different points. I just hope that we get to, I don't care when they fight, I just hope that they do fight. That's the main thing. I'm not, pushing one fighter over another in these sort of situations. And this is the thing. Some people, when I sort of talk about that Dillian Whtte situation and bring up some of the history, they say, oh, you're hating on Whtte. It's not. It's just sort of saying, what happened and, how it is. I mean, we can sort of say that Tyson Fury shouldn't have been fighting, Otto Wallin and Tom Schwarz and gone straight into that rematch, which, I think we all wanted at the time. But the history is what it is at this point. I just hope we see these fights, because if we only see one or two of them fighting each other out of about half a dozen or 8 guys that should be having a bit of a round robin and putting on the best fights, this sort of era will, because there was optimism 2 or 3 years ago, we're coming into a bit of a golden age for the sport, and it just really hasn't quite panned out, and politics and, sort of that sort of side of it has been a big part of it. Everyone trying to A-side each other to death. Fight Night says, I think Horn, but either man has a good chance. Yeah, I think, I agree with that. I mean, maybe I would go with Horn just on experience, but I mean, if he's on the way down, and I mean, remembering, he looked, a lot better at 147 than he has done at, 154 and 160. So Home Wrecking Knee Knocker says, any thoughts on Clay vs Congo, best matchup of the card? Well, I mean, I've heard a lot about these two different guys and this matchup being a good addition to the card, but I really haven't seen... I think I remember Chris Congo on a pay-per-view maybe 2 years ago. I mean, and there was some talk about him there that he was a really good prospect, but it just doesn't seem to... Things haven't panned out for him in terms of the progression, but hopefully it is a good fight. I mean, most of these fights look like they are solid and good matchups, but you could question as well, should they be on a pay-per-view? I mean, the Babic and Winters one, which we'll come to soon, I think, that's a really decent fight. But it's got 0 divisional relevance, and you can argue probably doesn't deserve to be on a pay-per-view card, especially a 5-fight pay-per-view card. If it had about 8 fights, yeah, sure. I mean, bearing in mind that Babic was on the Oscar Rivas card, I mean, I think about 99% of us have forgotten that. I mean, I couldn't remember him on that. I'm not sure if he was on the televised portion or what, but yeah. So Spaghetti Leg says, Dubois getting hyped up at this stage, but he's like 3 years, 8 to 10 fights away from mixing with top 5 guys. He's still a novice. Yeah, to an extent, I agree with you that he needs some decent seasoning fights to prepare him. And this is the frustrating thing. It's not a dig at Dubois that I'm having. Frank Warren should be doing better for his fighter, because Dubois needs those fights where he can get some tests. I mean, if he's having 4 or 5 fights a year, but 3 or 4 of them are basically nothing fights, how does that help him? Because clearly there's a reason he is regarded as the top prospect, or at least close to it, for heavyweight boxing, because there's a lot to like about what he does. But perhaps, maybe, some people will see this pull out, this, stopping the Pfeiffer fight in terms of having this Ricardo Snijders come in. Maybe they will see this as perhaps there's something wrong. Maybe that he's plateauing, he needs more of these level fights, or maybe there's an injury. We just don't know. There could be more behind this. Winter's going to knock out SLAO Babic. You know what I'm saying. And that was quite funny. Yeah, Alan Babic, English as second language. He was trying to trash talk with Shondell Winters, spelling out slow, SLAO. So, yeah, that was quite the comical moment. Double RT boxing with Mr. A. He says he likes the Dave bringing. Okay, I'm not sure what you're meaning there, but... Double RT Boxing with Mr. A. That's also another YouTube channel that I watch quite a bit. Yeah, if there's a fight in a back alley somewhere in the sort of back streets of Singapore, Double RT Boxing with Mr. A is covering it. So yeah, he covers a lot of... I wouldn't say... Yeah, I mean, I guess I am saying obscure, but yeah, he covers fights at all levels of the sport. So yeah, very good in-depth knowledge, especially of the lower weight classes in particular. The way Whtte treated Mark Tibbs might see Karma knocking on Whyte's door and see Povetkin knocking Whyte out. Okay, I'm falling way behind on the chat here, but I'll just get into this because I think it's worth just sort of getting into this issue of the upset. Am I expecting the upset? Not necessarily, but would I be surprised if there was an upset? No. I think Alexander Povetkin is, a seasoned veteran. He's an old dog with some good tricks, but he is on the slide. So, I mean, there's a reason most of us are picking Dillian Whtte. If this was like 6 or 7 years ago, Whtte would be an underdog. But this is, what, a 60-40 type fight. I think most people are, a majority of people are expecting Whtte to come through this, that he might wear out Povetkin and potentially stop him late on or get a decision. I mean, there's several ways this fight could play out. But Dillian Whtte, he is a vulnerable fighter. Most of these heavyweights are vulnerable fighters to some extent. He's been down in some fights. And he is open to being hit. Sometimes the balance is terrible, sort of, swinging wildly, all that sort of stuff. So if he lost, if Povetkin was able to catch him with a left hook, or, he does that, really good overhand right where he sort of dips down to his left and you think he's going to be coming up with a hook or, maybe a jab or something, then he throws that right hand in. I actually saw Barry Jones breaking that down quite nicely, and they showed him hitting a number of guys, including with that overhand right, including Anthony Joshua. So, yeah, I mean, Dillian Whyte's not a defensive maestro, but, on offense, he's got some good tricks in his tool bag. And remembering he's the bigger man, he's the younger man, much fresher. These are the reasons that he's the favorite here. And he's been preaching maximum violence, so he wants to go in there and make a statement. And the fact he's come in the shape that he has, he is going to, be in basically, it looks like, career best shape. So we'll have to see what he hits the scale at, which is going to be after this live stream, obviously. What's it in, I think, 4 or 5 hours after this live stream. So if you're listening back on the archive, disregard this portion of the video. But yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting fight for a number of reasons. I know that there's some people been hating on the card, saying it's not pay-per-view worthy, but it is the most significant heavyweight fight so far since boxing has been back. It's 2 top 10 guys. So for anyone who says that this is a nothing fight, that it's a waste of space, I disagree with it. That there is divisional relevance here, and there is the WBC mandatory on the line. So it's a fight with some good storylines, and Povetkin sort of being, I mean, people will say that Whyte has, with picking Povetkin, that he's picked the guy with some name value, but it's a winnable fight. And this is sort of, what people have said of Whyte's sort of career from turning down certain fights. Picking Rivas, a guy he was expected to beat. Chisora, that he was expected to beat in the rematch, although that was a very competitive fight. And this is the thing, Whyte might be, having some of these guys that he's a slight favourite to win or something like that, or in this case more of a 60-40 type, but he's still been getting the job done. He might have looked a bit vulnerable, but he's been getting the victory. And you've got to give him credit for that Parker performance. He sort of, made it his fight, rough and ready and dirty, and let's face it, he got the win. And that's all that matters at the end of the day. And you can kind of look at Whyte and Parker since that moment, which was 2 years ago, and Parker basically has fallen off the map. Just 3 tune-ups since, and nothing of relevance. Whyte has kicked on. And sometimes you've got to make your luck, you've got to take the opportunities, and Dillian Whyte has certainly done that. And he's been getting well paid in the process. So in terms of the way his career has been panning out, the way he's been managing himself, you can't fault that, because he's been making every post a winner and been collecting those multi-million-dollar paydays in the process. In terms of turning down other opportunities, well, that is what it is. He's been criticised for that, and the whole 1,000 days thing, that narrative that's been floating around, yeah, it is what it is. So Marcus says, I think Pfeiffer is about the same level or so as Gorman. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably, I mean, it's really hard to say, because Pfeiffer has been fighting in obscurity. I mean, he had some decent wins as an amateur, but it doesn't necessarily translate that he's going to have a stellar career as a pro. So I haven't been able to get a level on Pfeiffer, because we really haven't seen him in the fights to get that. But, I mean, I don't think that's probably an unfair comparison. And in his mid-30s, what's he really going on to do? So, yeah, I mean, maybe that's a fair comparison, but it's sort of hard to say. Fight Night Production says he thinks Winters can beat Babbage. I think there's an I think that's an unpopular opinion. No, I don't necessarily think it's an unpopular opinion. It's a good time to sort of get into the that press conference, that little bit of extra spice that was added to this fight. That was it was sort of unexpected how sort of tatchy that ended up getting, but Winters gave as good as he got. And we have to remember, Babic is only, 3 fights heading into this. Winters more experienced, he's fought at a better level, and he has stopped, a guy who potentially similar sort of talent level to Alen Babic. We're talking Alexander Teslenko. He was a prospect with some buzz, and he was upset by Shawndell Winters. So if it goes, more than 3 or 4 rounds, because I think this is an 8-rounder, or is it a 6-rounder? No, I think it's 8. Someone can correct me on that one if they've got that handy on BoxRec. But if it goes past 2 or 3 rounds and Alen Babic is really expending a lot of energy early on, sort of like Teslenko was to an extent in the Winters fight, I think Winters, if he can survive an early onslaught, because I think Babic is going to come forward, be aggressive, and try to take him out of there. He's really said, look, I'm going to knock you out, and if I can't win, I'm going to retire. But if Babic sort of starts to gas, if he doesn't have the success he thinks he's going to have, Winters is certainly in this fight. I don't think that's an unpopular opinion. I think I've seen many people saying, is this a step too far at this point? And I think the only reason this fight has been made, Winters and Babic, is they needed a somewhat credible opponent for Babic, because otherwise if it was Babic versus a journeyman who had a sort of 7-15 record, that wouldn't have been very popular for the card. Force Ghost Fabio says, talk of a new division from 201 to 225. I think Tyson coming back for that. You mean Mike Tyson? No, I don't think Mike Tyson's coming back for professional fights, all that sort of stuff. I think he'll, if there's this Legends League and he's going to fight guys like James Toney or Vander Holyfield, that sort of stuff, I could see that. And it's relatively low risk if they're going to be exhibitions, make millions of dollars each, and, he can pour that into charity projects. I think that's where his energy will be. I mean, remembering Tyson's been out of the ring for 15 years and looked dreadful at the point that he retired. And he's been smoking weed like a chimney for, years and years and years. I think the hype about him coming back and doing something in the heavyweight division is just that, hype. Sarkul says, trained with Babic in the, can't really pronounce that word, Petaj gym in Zagreb. Expect him to go through Winters like it's nothing this weekend. And if he does, and this is the really good sort of platform for Babic to do it, because there's more focus on it. A year ago when he was on the Rivas card, it was one of those things where, he was at the bottom of the card, sort of the first or second fight. Not even sure it was on the sort of pay-per-view card as it was, or if it was, people forgot about it. But there's more focus on him a year on, facing an opponent who's, fought at a certain level. He's a gatekeeper, and if Winters gets blown out by Alen Babic, it's a good statement for Babic. But, it'll be interesting to see where they can take him, because at this point, it's a bit of a weird time with the pandemic and all that sort of stuff, and careers are going to be sort of stalling out for a year or two. So this might make a sort of a few waves if he can sort of blast Winters out of there. But then can they sort of kick on to do something relatively soon after? Because it might be one of these things, some of these guys might only fight once or twice this year, and it might not be always the fights that people would like to see them in. So Home Wrecker says Babic will demolish Winters. Double RT Boxing with Mr. A says, does Warren have anyone after Joe for Daniel? It's a good question, because if Joe Joyce loses to Daniel Dubois, for example, and Dubois looks good, what is the what next? There will be some potential opponents out there, but Warren would have to, I think, because he's not really connected or working with a lot of the sort of heavyweight stables that have sort of stashed away a lot of talent. And sure, there's the relationship with Top Rank, but Top Rank's building a stable for Top Rank in the United States. They're in the Top Rank business, not necessarily propping up Warren's UK sort of stable. But there are guys out there, like an Otto Varlin, for example, that might make sense. But in this sort of time and sort of seeing the sort of lay of the land, they might have to overpay to get him. But I think there's definitely going to come a point in 2021 where Dubois will be ordered by the WBO, if he keeps winning, in a final eliminator. And it could potentially end up being against a guy like Joseph Parker. You could see that. So Will Stokes says he's really excited for this weekend, really rooting for Whtte and Taylor to take wins, confident they'll do so. Whtte looking in fantastic shape for this one too. Well, it looks like he's left no stone unturned and looking in something approaching career best shape. And Will also says, reckon Taylor does it via slick and smart decision, Whtte via a mid or late round stoppage or perhaps a decision. What are your thoughts on the results squared? Well, I'm picking Whtte. That's not a terribly confident pick. It's, I think, the younger, fresher man, but I'm not going to be shocked if Povetkin wins. But I do think Whtte should win. But if he doesn't, that conversation, if he loses this one, people are going to be harking back to he had other opportunities he could have taken. So that's a conversation for another day. But I do expect, that is if he loses, but I do expect he will win. I think Taylor, after sort of getting involved in a bit of a war with Persoon a year ago, I think she will come in with a different game plan. She will want to be a bit slicker, rely on her boxing. Scott says he can't wait for the big clash, Lovejoy versus Bryan, if they're ever going to announce that. So Wayne says, oi oi boxing squared, hello to you too. And just bear in mind, if you've just joined the chat, we've got 94 in the building here at the moment. I'm probably like 10 minutes behind on the chat, so I'm trying to catch up here. So if you've left a comment and I haven't responded to it, it's not because I'm ignoring it, it's because I'm just very far behind in the chat here. But wherever you are in the world, morning, noon or night, I hope you're having a good one. Thank you for joining another Boxing Squared live stream. We're already 51 minutes into it. I honestly thought I was going to look up and it was going to be about 25, 30 minutes, but sometimes these things just, flash by in the blink of an eye. Cash Cow says, honestly, Joyce is making up the numbers in the division, but could get lucky and get a big payday. He's an easy beat for the top level dudes. Well, at this point, and I covered this in a Patreon video, and if you do want to join Patreon, which I do weekly topical videos, and often it's on issues that sort of, the videos that I do, they're more sort of, they don't date so quickly. So it's an issue that might be around for 3 to 6 months. But part of what I was talking about in a recent video was what I was calling the concertina effect. And because of the current situation in the heavyweight division, you've got the top end of the division clogged up with mandatories and all that sort of stuff. But then you throw the pandemic into the mix, slowing everything down. It's going to potentially hamper the division for some time, possibly 2 or 3 years, and guys like Joyce could be caught up in that. Someone like Joyce might have thought, well, worst case scenario, if I keep winning, I might get a title shot by 2022 or something like that. But the way it's going, he may not ever see a title shot, even if he does keep winning, just because everything's so clogged up and backed up. And you think guys like him, who he's soon to be 35, the best part of his, or some part of his prime, is going to ebb away as the sort of, things sort of work out in the heavyweight division in the next 2 or 3 years. So for him, I do hope that he manages to make as much money in the sport as he can. Obviously, he turned pro late, 32. But timing is a big thing in the sport of boxing just in general. But right now, getting a title shot, it could be slightly rarer than hen's teeth. I mean, a lot of these guys who are around 30 and maybe nowhere near it, only just getting ranked, it could be like 4 or 5 years before they see a title shot. If you start thinking of starting to play out, you've got a couple of mandatories, and then if you have undisputed, that could be a couple of fights or something like that. All of a sudden, 2 years is gone. Think about it. Tony says, Frank reckons the first boy to fight Daniel Dubois got called because he didn't bring his MRI papers and instead brought an MRB. Well, in terms of what Errol Seelan is saying, they've submitted the correct and requisite sort of paperwork. They weren't contacted, weren't told of any issues. And surely, even if they submitted something wrong, wouldn't you go back to them and say, you've given us the wrong thing, we need this? And at about 10, remember, so the fight was changed at about, 9 or 10 days notice. And there were rumours a few days before. Surely there was still some time. Seemingly they pulled the trigger pretty quick on this. And Errol Seelan, as I covered earlier, I actually read out some quotes so you can catch that on archive. He is pissed off. He's saying that Warren and everyone associated with him are ashholes. First Round Boxing says, do you think Parker vs. Farr will happen, Mr. Squared? At some point, if not next, eventually. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. So Blue Collar Sports TV, he's got a channel as well. Great channel, one of my favourites. He says, sup lads, anyone here seen a potential upset in Babbage versus Winters? I wouldn't be shocked. Winters has beat prospects in the past. And we were just talking about that before. I think someone said that it was potentially an unpopular opinion. I don't think it's that unpopular of an opinion. There is some scope for that. Winters has been here. He's fought at a better level than Alan Babbage. And a guy like Alexander Teslenko and Alan Babbage, just on the face of it, don't seem worlds apart in terms of talent and ability. But we will see. I mean, if Alan Babbage can come through this and look dominant, you know, that's going to be very good for his career. So Wayne says Frank got cold feet about the opponent and changed it. As I was saying earlier, there seems to be more going on in that situation than meets the eye. Wayne says even the presser was a nice shock for Babbage. Well, I think he sort of thrived on that too. You know, he always seems like a guy that's a sort of like a coiled spring, that he's ready. You sort of get that, you know, menacing vibe about Alan Babbage. So it wasn't surprising to me to see that Winters was able to push his buttons and get a reaction out of him. And I think probably pretty deliberately from Winters too. I mean, he will know that Babbage, the younger guy, and remember, there's all sorts of stories about what Babbage has been doing in sparring, but if he can get under his skin and make him blow his sort of wad early in the fight and do what Alexander Teslenko did and sort of gas out, and then Winters was into that fight. I was actually meant to do an interview with Shaundell Winters, and I got up at 5 o'clock this morning to do it, but for whatever reason, I couldn't get through on the Facebook Messenger. So, yeah, that was a bit disappointing. But, yeah, because it would have been one of the things I wanted to ask him, obviously, after, you know, talking about this fight, etc., was with that Teslenko fight, at what point did he know and feel that he had it? Because, you know, there was a point in that fight at about the third round where there was a real change in momentum. So, yeah, I wanted to sort of just get his thoughts from, you know, at that time in the ring, what was he thinking? So Homewrecker says, anyone who gave Pursoon the first fight either bet on her or they have a drug problem. Well, I didn't bet on her, and I don't have a drug problem, and I thought Pursoon won. And I think a lot of other people did too. I know the word robbery is thrown around, but I thought Pursoon won. I mean, this is the reason the rematch is happening too. I mean, they could have gone for someone else, but they knew that after the Amanda Serrano fight fell over, you know, getting Pursoon in was going to be seen as a credible fight, because obviously a lot of people believe that Taylor lost that fight. I mean, I would sort of put it back on you, Homewrecker. The fact that you said that, does that display that you had a bias for Katie Taylor winning the first fight? I mean, I didn't have any horse in the game. It was an unexpectedly good fight to watch a year ago. So Daniel says, if you could choose one promoter to rule over boxing Dana White style, who would you choose? None of them. None of them. AZ says, John Fury versus Porky Russ. Okay, I'm not sure what that's about. I do actually watch a bit of Porky's Corner. Quite entertaining. Homewrecker says, Clay or Congo. AZ, Battle Royale on Sunday. Legendary Movie Scene says, anyone think Joe Daniel might get cancelled? Just join so if anyone already said this. Sorry. I'm not sure if anyone's really sort of got into that, but there is the potential for that. And I guess this next bit that I'll say sort of follows on from that previous conversation that we were having about Pfeiffer being out and Ricardo Snyder's being in. But if it does get cancelled, they're going to have more interim fights. And I think it's highly likely that it could get cancelled because Frank Warren's indicated he needs the crowd. He's sort of spinning it more as the energy, it's a big fight that deserves it. But clearly it's about money. That's really what it's about. So there was Francis Warren out in Poland a number of weeks ago talking to Mariusz Whtte and also Lucas Rozansky. And this is the thing that, with this Pfeiffer fight being off, that, it sort of doesn't make sense to me. If there is something to the fact that they were worried that maybe he'd be more of a test than initially thought, I mean, if they're lining up the likes of Lucas Rosansky or Marius Vak as interim opponents for Joe Joyce or Daniel Dubois, I mean, Pfeiffer's kind of on the sort of same level as Rosansky potentially. Maybe it's there or thereabouts. So I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see. Unrivaled says, Dell, I actually favour Winters. And I think there's going to be a number of people who fall into that maybe this is a step too far at this point, but if Babbage comes through, looks good, very good for him. Lou Buck says, I can see Babbage versus Winter being a little like Romero versus Marinez. I obviously heard about that fight. I was only sort of catching bits because there was 2 cards on at once. Plus I was working on some videos at the time as well, just editing, watching stuff in the background. So I didn't see that Rolly Romero, robbery as it were. But I certainly heard about it from all the channels that I watch. And, I've seen some highlights and I've obviously seen Romero basically trash talking everyone. I mean, it sounds like they need to make that fight again. So Ace says, number 1 should always be mandatory. Well, often that is the case, but you have to be made the mandatory. If you're number 1, you're not just the mandatory. There is a distinction. And at the point that Whtte was number 1, first made number 1, Brazil was the mandatory. And people forget this. So they say Whyte's been mandatory for 3 years. It's not the case. Let Me Suck Your Toes says, greetings from Belarus. Fantasy fight of Varlin versus Whtte. Who wins? Well, definitely not the fans. I don't think that would be a very good viewing fight. On paper, it sounds good and maybe at a comparable level, but I think that would be a massive stinker. Cash Cow says, terrible fight for the fans. Rather watch paint dry. I think people will echo some of those sentiments. Double RT Boxing with Mr. A says he's got Horn versus Tim, $5. Okay, I'm slowly catching up with the chat. I'm probably only 10 minutes behind. I'm slowly getting there. So if you've left a comment, apologies if I haven't got to it. But we've got 87 in the building. If you like the stream, if you like the content in general, 90 in the building now, smash that like button on the way in or the way out, as they say. Also, if you want to check out my Patreon, weekly videos, patreon.com/boxing squared. And if you haven't seen, I sometimes pin a comment, and I talked about this once or twice before. I recently launched a new YouTube channel. It's more of a sort of outdoors camping, fishing type one video a week, so it's a lot less volume than this one. It's called Amazing New Zealand. It was my old backup channel, 99 Boxing. So do check that out if you feel so inclined. First Round Boxing says, who do you want to win, Parker versus Farr? Well, I think Parker wins that one at this point. You have the problem, and I've spoken about this before. I mean, even though David Higgins is trying to do the sales pitch job to the New Zealand public, now he's saying Junior Farr's becoming a household name. He's not. He doesn't have the wins right now to have made him a guy that people really know much about. He's not a household name here in New Zealand. There's the odd story about him, but it's pretty few and far between. Parker is New Zealand boxing pretty much, and after that it's, there's a vast gulf until coverage for other fighters. So Parker's the household name. It's sold at this event, will be sold on his name. They'll be trying to talk up some of the elements, but Junior Farr, I think people might back him a bit more if he had some wins on the resume that they could point to and go, yeah, that gives him a shot in this fight. At the moment, I don't think he's done enough. I think it's way undercooked. But this might be as David Higgins has said before, in terms of a regional fight, the best of a bad situation because of the pandemic. So Force Ghost Fabio says, did you catch the Atlas interview with Whytte? He said his weight is going to be 230-ish. If so, I changed my pick to Whytte KO. I haven't caught that interview, but I did say the other day after in a video that I did during Fight Week, or in Fight Week I should say, it's still Fight Week, that I thought potentially the 230 wasn't out of the question because he's trimmed up so much. But you also have to remember sometimes these guys, in that sort of tapering phase and the sort of week 10 days out, end up putting on, they have a bit more food, all that sort of stuff. They're getting a bit of energy, eating. They can end up sort of putting on 5, 10, sometimes 15 pounds. I mean, remember, I think it was Anthony Joshua from a couple of years ago. He put on about 10 pounds in the final week ahead of his fight. I think it was against Carlos Takam, and I think he came in at something like 254 or whatever it was. Whatever it was his career high at that point, and they hadn't sort of really monitored so much in fight week what he was doing in terms of his intake, and he's just sort of, put on some easy pounds. So Scott70 says, hit the like button, chaps. Yes, please. Michael Johnson at Boxing Talk and More is in the chat. He says, what it do? So he's got a YouTube channel too. Check it out. Lubuck says Dubois made a poor choice in signing a 5-year deal with Frank Warren. I mean, you can make the case either way, because if he was at Matchroom, he'd be quite far down the totem pole compared to what they've got. How big would Matchroom be pushing him at this point? Because you've got other highly touted prospects, for example, Filip Hrgović, sort of seem to be floundering a little bit on these co-promotional deals that they've signed with Matchroom. Bert says, jab the like button. Yes, please. Big Boy says, do you think Winters would give Dubois a better fight than Snyder's? Absolutely. Winters would knock out Snyder's. RT Boxing with Mr. A says, Dave Caldwell bringing my friend. Yeah, I think that's a good addition to the corner. Cash Cow says, Whtte said yesterday he's coming in 245 or 250. If he's coming in around 245, that ends up being a good weight for him. He's fought, some of, the better fights in his career, about that fight. But also, sometimes when he's been in the high 250s, he's put on a good effort too. But I think in terms of the guy that's in front of him, who's likely to be coming in somewhere between 225 and 229, Povetkin's consistently weighed between there. I mean, I think coming in a bit more nimble is going to be good for Whtte. Bacon and Egg says, smash the like button. Yes, please. Either on the way in or the way out. 85 in the building. So, get those likes up, please. Much appreciated. Force Ghost Fabio is thanking Cash Cow. So James Baker with a little bit of a song there. Joyce to the world, all the boys and girls. Joyce to the feathers in the deep blue sea. Ibrahim says Winters beat Teslenko, so he's decent. He's smaller though. Yeah, I mean, Teslenko had a little bit of hype about him. Ultimately, he hasn't panned out to this point, even after that defeat. But Winters, he's a gatekeeper. If you're not good enough, the gate will be closed on you. Fraser Steen with the interesting spelling there of Babbage. He wins after 3 wins. I'll be impressed. Yeah, it will be an impressive performance if he gets by Winters and in good fashion. So James Baker says, Joe Joyce is paying $360 here in Sydney. I'm on $300 for Joyce. It's pretty long odds, isn't it? Yeah. I'm not really a betting man in terms of sports betting, but that feels like that's quite wide. But there's a few factors with that, a couple of things, and I won't get into it here, but I'm going to be covering this in a Patreon video that does give me cause for concern with Joyce. But then having some of the stuff that's happened this week with Dubois and this whole Snyder's fight and the whole sort of cloak and dagger about what's really going on here, and the EC Boxing promoter Errol Seelan saying, hang on, you're just talking a bunch of crap, we could have sent you the right paperwork if you got back to us. It does make me wonder what's going on there. Is there an injury for Dubois, or are they just wanting to bring him along slower because of something? There's lots of questions coming out this. Mike May says, what's your opinion on Frank Warren's recent offers? Seems like he wants a leg up from Eddie. Well, perhaps they've I've talked about this before, but perhaps they've run the numbers on if this sort of pandemic, sort of what's happening, continues for some time. And remembering Queensbury at the moment, doesn't have a massive stable. It's hard to get some of the big names in at the moment because of the pandemic. Even before, they weren't necessarily able to get the big names in for their fighters. It just could be sort of forecasting going, we could be in some trouble if we can sort of put some pressure on, get some fights made, that it could sort of ease that. So, I don't know. I mean, cooperation is good, but I think if they've got to be realistic about some of the fights too. Like Dubois versus Whtte is not realistic at all. But I hope some of those fights that they listed happen, like Yard and Buatsi. I mean, that feels like a natural fight to happen, and that it could probably happen now. Thoughts on Fundora versus Gallimore? Well, that's interesting. I mean, I noticed that in a PBC Instagram post, they were saying Fundora is 6'5.5", whereas previously I'd seen him listed at 6'7". But I think that, I mean, Gallimore has lost to a number of guys, but people forget, I think he beat, I'm pretty sure it was Jason Rosario at some point, and he's obviously the champion at the moment. Gallimore could actually, take this one. I haven't seen anything in Fundora to make me think he's actually any good, but we shall see. And he's a big guy that doesn't really use his height either. Jumbo says Persoon will not allow Taylor to box. She will force her into a fight. Taylor has her work cut out. Yeah, but she'll be prepared, for that same sort of fight again, and she'll want to not sort of engage in the way that she did in the first fight. So I could see a much slicker effort from Taylor, as someone had alluded to earlier on. Sakul says he saw Ajit Caballero get his ass kicked by Babic on a video he brought back to the gym. I don't think Winters can take it. Yeah, and I've heard a few people talking about Ajit Caballero and Alan Babic having sparred. Obviously, I haven't seen anything. It's just rumours that I've heard. But Dillian Whtte apparently liked, the work that he had from Alan Babic and wanted to, very keen to sign him and bring him into his management stable. So he must really see something in Babic to want to sort of have him on his sort of side, just like Fabio Wardley. And others as well, like Richard Riekpo, but obviously he's at cruiser. So Chris says, great weekend. So I've just got the hiccups now. Great weekend of boxing. Babic versus Williams, potential upset. Winters. We'll see. I mean, I'm expecting Babic to win, but, it could be a much tougher fight than, I think at this point, because Winters has fought at a better level, it's certainly a step up. So there's intrigue there for me. Big Simpin says Winters is near Povetkin's age. Babic is 29. I go Babic. Big Simpin says Blue Collar is an excellent channel. Yes, he is. Blue Collar Sports TV. Do check him out if you haven't already done so. Does some great, previews, just good content in general. The one problem could be overconfidence. If Babic goes for the KO and gets hit on the counter and dropped by Winters, it's heavyweight boxing. And I think we saw in that Parker fight, Winters was landing a few counters. So, yeah, and if Babic does sort of gas out, if he goes for it and doesn't get the results early, and remember, this is a bigger stage, there's one thing being a great fighter in the gym, but sometimes they don't translate it into, their actual pro bouts. So we'll see what Babic can do. I mean, we haven't seen much of him. He does have some footage up on his Instagram page of some of his recent fights, but, sometimes they haven't gone very long. So hopefully this one goes a few rounds, so then we can actually get a bit of an indication of where his level is at. Obviously, Dillian Whtte likes it. Jambo says Frank wants to increase viewership for BT Sports. Eddie will give a fight to get a fight, a handout, kind of, because without it he will struggle to get intrigue for what he is prepared to put on. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a point to be said that it can work as a good two-way street, that maybe there is some fights that they can work on. I don't think that Eddie Hearn's going to want to necessarily just, prop Frank Warren up, as some people have suggested, but I think there are fights that they could work out that would be good for the fans, because if this pandemic continues for an extended period and sort of strangles the sport in different ways, the cooperation angle, Matchroom may be forced to work with Queensbury on a couple of fights, because for both it's mutually going to be a good deal. Big Boy says, do you think Warren would be happy to let Dubois get destroyed by Whtte if he meant it could get his hands on half of the AJ Fury undisputed money? Well, I think that they're expecting that the AJ Fury one's going to happen anyway. So I don't know if that would come into it at all. But Frank Warren is definitely sort of pinning his hopes on Dubois to sort of be the guy for the next decade. And we have to consider that a lot of the guys right now, your Joshuas, Whttes, others, I mean, remembering primes can often be very short. So they might have a good few years left, but then Dubois could start coming into his own. So, I mean, he wants to play the long game with Dubois. I think some of what has been happening has been more about building Dubois' profile, because if you keep connecting his name to Whttes or other fighters, you do get some, latent sort of exposure off that, and people getting and it's been patently clear to me, at least, that they've been connecting his name to Whtte in the last couple of weeks because, one, White's got a fight coming up. People are more interested in Whtte at the moment, than usual, because, more coverage of him with the fight coming up, and Dubois' name's factored into that. He gets a boost in profile. But also, because he's got a fight coming up, they're trying to sort of build a bit more attention for that. Although, not sure with this new opponent how much interest will be in that. So Robin says, I thought Katie won, but she looked worse at the end, so I'm glad the rematch has come, and well done, Katie, taking it. Well, the rematch will answer some questions, and I think if she wins, a clear decision or something like that, then obviously that's going to sort of put that sort of issue to bed, because a lot of people thought Pursuit won the first time. Just have a sip and I'll work my way down the chat here. Got a few other topics, but I want to try catch up on the chat just a little bit. A lot of talk about... So boxing... Jambo says, Boxing Squared, I posted this message 15 minutes ago. Okay, so yeah, I'm saying, I'm like at least 10 minutes behind on the chat. I'm trying to catch up. Lubark says he has to run. Excellent stream as usual. Boxing Squared, thank you for joining. You probably left 15 minutes ago, but I appreciate you turning up. Big Simping since Junior Farr versus Parker will it sell? A must watch, but not if guys get peanuts pay. Well, Higgins was saying that the concession that they've made is at least $500,000 guaranteed for Junior Farr, and then there's going to be some pay-per-view upside. But I think their fight is undercooked. I have my doubts how well it will sell, but yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people will be tuning in, but you have to remember in this environment as well, some people won't want to part with $40 or $50 in New Zealand. Some people have lost jobs, due to the pandemic. It's a tougher time, and Joseph Parker hasn't really fought anyone for 2 years, so his profile has been a little bit down on where it once was when he was on the way up and also was the champion. And since then, he's, obviously the loss to Whtte and 3 tune-ups since. So Cash Cow, he's got a split. Thanks, Boxing Squared. First round boxing. I know you're picking Parker, but who will be cheering for? I know you've interviewed Farr a few times. Will you neutral, or do you have a fan of one more than the other? Well, I'm hoping for a good fight. I mean, I wouldn't be saying that I was, hoping one wins over the other. I think just, based on form, resume, all that sort of stuff, Parker should win. So Bacon and Eggs says SLAO. That's the Alan Babbage from the presser. That was quite funny. I didn't pick it up to begin with, and I watched it back, and I was like, geez. I mean, you can tell English isn't his first language, but that was a clanger. Anthony says, remember this name for the future, Giovanni Whtte. He's going to be the next heavyweight champion of the world. The kid is amazingly talented. Okay, we'll keep a lookout for that one. Hardline Boxing Talk. It's nice to see there are still some channels in the YTBC actually focused on boxing. And if you haven't followed Hardline Boxing Talk, recommend you do so. Great historical knowledge of the sport. Does reviews of fighters from all divisions, different decades, has some great content on the channel, and does some very good live streams too. First Round Boxing says, and of course, if you didn't know, Hardline Boxing Talk was boxing librarian. So yeah, obviously, Hardline Boxing Talk is, it must be at least more than a year now. First Round Boxing. Sorry if my comments post more than once missed squared. Well, yeah, if you are leaving a comment and I haven't responded to it, that is because I'm behind in the chat, but slowly getting there. Unga says, top amateur talents, Kunkabayev makes pro debut this weekend on ESPN+. Well, that's actually, because I was looking at the MTK press release, must have been a few days ago. That card is going to be broadcast on, that he's on, from Kazakhstan. It's going to be on IFL TV. So you can just watch IFL and get that card. So good spot there. So yeah, Kunkabayev, he is one of those guys that was a good amateur. This is his pro debut. He signed with MTK, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I didn't initially see the press release, but I did catch it the other day when I was got the newsletter from Asian Boxing. Anthony says, Taylor looks like she's going to lose her belts. I can feel the upset coming. Joshua says, I have a good question at Boxing Square. Does Povetkin fight with the same European style as Oleg Muskayev to you? I don't know. Big Simping says, if Whtte don't KO Povetkin, he never deserves the world title. That'd be a bit unfair. I could totally see this going to points. Big Simping says, if Klitschko era Dillian Whtte would be a mandatory defense KO for Vlad inside 8, I don't get the hype with this guy Whtte. Well, I mean, that's the thing. You keep winning, your profile builds, your pay builds, and the hype builds. He's been in some pretty competitive fights where he hasn't always looked, extremely polished, but he's got the job done. You can't knock him for that. He keeps winning. So Martin says, Povetkin could end these WBC mandatory problems this weekend. Great night of boxing lined up. And if that happens, there's going to be a contingent of fans coming out, mercilessly trolling Whtte and the sort of questioning the actions of his career. I think actually I must have skipped about 20 or 30 comments by accident. So apologies for that. So if you want to get something in, I'll just get back to my topic list because I'm caught up on the chat now. So I clearly must have scrolled down and lost my place. So apologies for that. I think Whtte will be wobbled but stop Povetkin late, says Kevin Thornley. There is the potential for both to be hurt. The battle of the hookers, and they always say don't hook with the hooker. So who should be heeding that advice out of the two? I mean, I think Povetkin's got the better hand speed. But I think Whtte, younger, fresher man, I think if he is going to, I could see him using his height, his reach, that extra weight advantage, try to tire Povetkin out, making a bit dirty and rugged. Could totally be a fight where he's really trying to impose himself. Because initially, I mean, if you haven't watched my 10 things to watch for video, which was my major preview video, it's up about a week or so ago, I had been leaning, if Tibbs had been in the camp, I think they would have been a bit more safety first in terms of the strategy. Because we saw against Rivas and also the Chisora rematch, Dillian Whtte working more sort of on the back foot, using the ring, utilising it just a bit more than he had in other fights. But I think with Xavier Miller coming in and the sort of talk about maximum violence, all that sort of stuff, I think Dillian Whtte will be more aggressive, than otherwise if Tibbs had been in the corner. But that could play into Povetkin's hands as well. So UK Rob is in the chat there. He's part of the crew at Mixed Combat Radio. So if you haven't subscribed to them, do so. They do very good live streams that I enjoy. Gareth says, is Unga going to start doing his own boxing videos, reviews? Seems to have lots of knowledge. Yes, that he does. And obviously we've been working together on a sort of lineal history of the heavyweight division. Part 1 is up. I've been so busy the last sort of month and a half, I've managed to get to the other couple of videos, but it looks like the next week or two is going to be a little bit of a lull in the action. So I will, I've got it ready to record and go, but I've just got to get to it. So apologies to Unga for the wait on getting part 2 out. There's probably going to be a part 3 and a part 4. A lot of content that he's put together, researched, and it's up to me now to sort of put it into the system and get it edited up. Joshua says, what are your thoughts on McCaskill's win over Breakus? I actually thought it was a lot closer than the judges had it, because I think they had it 97-93. I thought McCaskill started fast and, was winning that first half of the fight, but I thought Breakus took over in the second half. So I was surprised it was so wide on two of the cards. I thought a draw was fair, or, if it was one round either way, but 97-93, I thought that was a little wide. So Simple Boy says, good morning from Scotland. Good morning to you. Big Simpin says, who is Manny Pacquiao fighting next? No idea. Don't think it's going to be Terence Crawford, even though Bob Arum and Top Rank have been sort of suggesting that. I think Crawford wants that fight, but it'll be a fight he'll never get. Thomas says, thoughts on Michael Hunter? He's sort of cast adrift at the moment. Having been let go from Matchroom, he's been calling out all number of fighters, looking slightly desperate actually, calling out Fabio Wardley, Dave Allen, those sorts of names. I know that he wants to get in a fight and he's willing to fight anyone, but I think they need to think about what he's saying in public, because it does give off a bit of a whiff of desperation, but he is a guy who's there or thereabouts in the top 10. Okay, I'm just going to go back to my list of topics. Where were we? So we've got through the Daniel Dubois opponent. Eric Pfeiffer not happy. He's going to be coming out saying some stuff on the next day, according to his social media. Obviously, I covered earlier his promoter, sort of sounding off at Frank Warren, saying that Warren, Queensbury and everyone associated with him are ashholes. Another thing, Tyson Fury telling Deontay Wilder that he won't wait forever, which, as people have pointed out, part of the delay for the fight too is Bob Arum, his co-promoter, saying that he wants to keep pushing the fight back. But it's interesting, we haven't seen or heard much from Wilder. He's taken the fight per the contract. Obviously, he must be putting in the work now. So I don't see the absence of Wilder necessarily being a bad thing. So what do you make on that? Tony Bellew to be appointed to the committee looking for a new division between 200 and 225 pounds, which I think is just ridiculous. I don't want to see any new divisions created. WBC, WBA, they're in a race to the bottom at the moment. And I was thinking about the WBA. It seems to be every weekend there's new interim belts, new gold belts, regular title belts being dished out like candy. And it seems to be the WBA strategy to deal with the pandemic is because they must have been like, okay, we're not getting the big fights right now, so we're not getting the big sanctioning fees. But what we are going to do is just create all sorts of belts across all sorts of divisions, so we can sort of, by volume, make up the money that we otherwise would have got from having one big fight. So I think it is that simple. It's, smart to a degree, but it just, all these belts, it's just really diluting things. It's ridiculous. And Gilberto Mendoza recently trying to justify it, saying it was a good thing. What a clown. And he was recently reappointed to, for another 5-year term or whatever it was. And I see Suleiman was reappointed for another 4-year term or whatever it was. These guys, it's just a rort, isn't it? So a couple of news and notes that I'll get to before getting back to some comments. So Christian Thun. So I was in contact with him ahead of his fight last week against Jason Bergman, which was a good performance. You can still find that. I did in the post-fight review of that. If you haven't caught Christian Thun, the German prospect, there's a link in the description of my post-fight review to where you can find that. So he says, because I got in contact with him because it wasn't clear if his fight was going ahead, but he came back to me after the fight and said, oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't get to you, da-da-da-da. So I asked him, when are you back in the ring? So he says October. Top Rank is saying F.A. Ajagba is going to be back in September. He's a recent signing for them, having left PBC, signing with Jay Prince and having a new team around him, new trainer Kay Karoma. Timothy Moten has announced on Instagram that he's got a new manager and that he will be back in the ring on a James Toney card in October. So, a couple of prospects going to be in action in the next couple of months. Just hopefully we're going to see a few more bigger names back too. Also, something interesting, you may have caught this, and I don't have Snapchat, so I just saw it on Michael Benson's Twitter. Anthony Joshua asking who has the better punch resistance, having a graphic up and saying that Tyson Fury had been dropped 4 times in his career, naming the names. Dillian Whtte had been dropped 3 times in his career, and then him having been dropped by 2 different fighters. So, yeah, I kind of thought it was a bit of a pointless question to ask, but yeah, it is there. So if you did catch that, what did you make of that? Also this weekend you have Joan Pablo Hernandez versus Kevin Johnson. You've got a prospect and Peter Kaderu on the undercard too, added quite late. So that's going to be a nothing fight that Kaderu is in. Got to say, I haven't been impressed with some of the fights that he's been in recently. My sort of, ceiling for him, I'm sort of bringing my expectations down. But Hernandez back after, what was it, 6 years out of the ring or something, versus Kevin Johnson, that's going to be probably a terrible fight. Also this weekend, because there's not a lot of boxing on, but you've got a young prospect, Arslan Aliev, who's actually a good fighter. He's beaten Kevin Johnson before. I mean, I guess at this point, who hasn't? He's fighting for the WBC youth title in Russia. And I think that covers everything in my list. I had about 10 different things. And so if you did miss the coverage with the talk at the start, we've talked about Whtte Pavek and Babbage Winters, Daniel Dubois and his new opponent. So if you want to go back and listen to that on archive, fill your boots. But I'll get back to the comments. Probably fallen way behind now. Yeah, there's a lot of comments. So easy to lose your place. I'll just have a drink of water while I find my place. So Ruben says, do you listen to Highfield Boxing? Yes, I do. So yeah, he's got some very interesting thoughts on different subjects, and I like the level of detail that he can go into on certain issues about roots boxing as well. I mean, I don't always agree with some of his opinions on certain other things, but his he has good analytical skills, and sometimes it's nice to have certain opinions that I might hold challenged by different thoughts. I like that sort of intellectual sort of conversation that he does bring to his podcasts. Joshua says, do you think Charles Martin has improved under Manny Robles? I don't know if we've really seen enough. I mean, there was that fight against Daniel Martz where he kind of was asleep for a couple of rounds before waking up. Yeah, I mean, Charles Martin, I think at this point kind of is what he is. I don't think he's ever going to be any better, and I don't necessarily think he's going to digress or anything like that either. Unger says they need to remove divisions, not add more. Yep, agree with that. UK Rob Boxing says there is a media ban on Wilder. Brian Custer told The Boxing Voice yesterday he tried to get Wilder on a show but was told no interviews. Well, that might, yeah. I mean, there's obviously something in place because just in general, he hasn't really done anything. The last major interview he did was with the PBC podcast, and that was back in April. As I raised in a video yesterday, he's only had half a dozen posts on his Instagram since May. Obviously, there were other things that have popped up as well, like that infamous twerking video, which is very unfortunate. I don't know why his fiancée would have done that to him and posted that, exposed him to that ridicule. Big Simpson says, I think Eddie Hearn should do a 12-hour fight night day and get more fights on even people from other countries and promoters on a Saturday midday to midnight. That would be quite an undertaking, actually. Joshua says, the WBA has Manuel Char at champion and hasn't fought in 3 years, for God's sake. They got to do something about that. And I'm still waiting for Char to come out and claim that Andy Ruiz has ducked him, with that news coming out that Ruiz and Areola has been agreed in principle. No announcement yet, but the reports were it has been agreed in principle. Big Simpson says that Manny Robles has defo improved Charles Martin. He still has bad feet, though. Yeah, often he can look like he's sort of in treacle. But, I think Charles Martin has rehabilitated his image to some extent. He's not considered the same, the sort of joke that he once was. I think in certain fights against someone like a Gerald Washington, where he showed, against a guy who doesn't necessarily move that well, move his head that well, that he can get some spectacular knockouts. It'd be interesting to see who they're going to line him up with next, because we've been talking about, who's Luis Ortiz fighting and who are some of these other PBC guys fighting, but it's been a bit quiet on the Charles Martin front. I mean, it's probably going to be an in-house fight, or if it's not an in-house fight, it might be sort of, at best case scenario, that sort of Christian Hammer level. Simple Boy says AJ's chin isn't as good as Fury's. Iana says, thoughts on Prime Povetkin versus Whtte? Thanks for the great vids. Well, Prime Povetkin beats Dillian Whtte in my view. I think just too quick, too sharp. I think, yeah, he would be all over Dillian Whtte. I mean, Whtte is a good fighter, but like a lot of these heavyweights, he's got his flaws that can be exploited. King says, do you listen to TBV? Used to myself, but found them far too biased. Yeah, I mean, I watch some videos, but generally it's more someone sends me a link to stuff related to heavyweight, that sort of thing. Like they had Christopher Lovejoy on, or recently they had Luis Ortiz's trainer Herman Caicedo on for, it was about an hour, and he gave some great stuff. But yeah, I mean, they do, I think sometimes their coverage can be a bit one-sided because they'll have guests on and they, sort of greasing up to the guest a bit, but they do some good content too. I don't want to slag them off or anything, but I watch some of the Boxing Voice stuff, but certainly not all. But yeah, it is a good channel. They do have a good platform to get some good guests on, which does obviously give us a good insight into certain things. Aaron says, do you listen to Blue Collar Sports TV or Unrivaled Boxing Talk? Yeah, I know, I listened to both of those. They were both actually in the stream earlier, so I was recommending people do check them out. Big Simping says, Parker Ruiz would beat Cha. Usyk and Bryan, a WBA ranked high should have a Cha fight. I mean, Manuel Cha, Trevor Bryan, yeah, they shouldn't have had belts on the line for the fights that they got them in anyway. We'll see what happens, but apparently Christopher Lovejoy is fighting Trevor Bryan next. No official announcement. The date seemingly has been pushed out. Christopher Lovejoy was actually on Barbershop Conversation. Someone sent me a link to that stream that he appeared on. He's now talking apparently for that fight. It's in October. We'll see. No announcement from Don King yet, who promotes Trevor Bryan. Liberalism is a cult, says Whtte claims he will be coming in at 248. So we've had about 4 different weights put across by different people so far in the stream. I think it's clear, though, whatever the weight's going to be, it's going to be a much better weight and a much more appropriate weight for this fight than he turned up in Saudi Arabia at a career heaviest for Marius Vach. Joshua says, I think Martin should fight Brazil. Well, I think that's one of those in-house fights that they could logically make, and I think it makes sense. I think Martin probably takes that one. I think Brazil is pretty, is a bit faded at this point. He's been in a lot of wars, taken a lot of punishment. I don't think his punch resistance is there anymore. Unrivaled says, do you think Povetkin gets heavily disrespected by fans for his resume? I hear people saying his resume is terrible, which is tragic. Yeah, no, I heard someone in a stream, actually it was a stream that I watch quite regularly, saying that Povetkin was overrated, as was his career. But as I've been saying for a long time, Povetkin's got one of the deepest resumes in the heavyweight division. He's put in work over the past decade. And I think people, even though he got a win over Hughie Fury in the past year, he got a draw with Michael Hunter, and it seems to be as well that Povetkin's effort in that fight, I thought Povetkin edged that 7-5, but as I said at the time, I could have seen it a draw, or I could have seen it the one round the other way, 7-5 for Michael Hunter. But he was competitive in that fight. But people seem to, be writing him off and saying that he's got nothing left, which I think on what we've seen, clearly he can still operate at a good level in the heavyweight division, even at 40 years old. So, we'll see. Sometimes fighters get old overnight, but, some people are probably, if Dillian Whtte goes through him and like a hot knife through butter, people might sort of look at Michael Hunter and go, where's his level at? That's just natural for people to do. But I think that was a good fight. Povetkin fought at a good level against Hunter. Sure, he was in some trouble early on, but he ended up coming back, rallying well, and there was that a knockdown that wasn't called in that fight. Hunter was, caught by the rope. So, yeah, I think people who say Povetkin's a hype job or, has never done anything in his career must have started following boxing more recently, because he's got a number of really good names on his resume. Liberalism is a cult, says 248 is what Whtte said in an interview that came out today with Teddy Atlas. This is from Whtte. Well, someone else quoted that interview and said apparently he said high 230, so I haven't seen the interview myself. Joshua says Povetkin has a better resume than Wilder. Unrivaled says, G'day Mr. Daly. John Daly says Povetkin's got a deep resume and only lost to Vlad and AJ. Povetkin is a real test for anyone. UK Boxing Rob says Povetkin was denied a knockdown versus Hunter. Yeah, and he was. And the way that the scorecards sort of turned out, that kind of was pivotal, I guess. But I thought that he won that 1-7-5, but it seems to be I'm in the minority who thought that. But like I say, I was happy with a draw, or I could have seen it 7-5 the other way for Michael Hunter. But there seems to be some reimagining of that fight. Like people throw that word around, robbery, so much these days for close fights, and that was a close fight. So yeah, if you thought it was a robbery, I mean, I'd like to know why it was a robbery. Because if you go through, and Povetkin, he did rally after, sort of been caught a little bit cold early on, Hunter was all over him. But he came back and he ended up finishing that fight pretty strongly. I mean, it was a good effort. But, I mean, this is maybe a slight cut above. I mean, I guess the question, if Michael Hunter was in this fight with Dillian Whtte, who would people be picking? Hunter's a bad style matchup, I think, for Dillian Whtte. Just, it's an awkward style matchup. And it was an awkward style matchup for Povetkin too. But, I would have liked to have seen the rematch. And I see Hunter has said he would like to have a rematch with Povetkin, potentially in Russia. But then again, Hunter's been saying all sorts of things recently, saying he wants a rematch with Martin Bakole in Congo. He's called out Fabio Wardley. He said Dave Allen, if he's available, he'll give him a fight. So it does sort of seem that, I think there was optimism that Michael Hunter was going to be scooped up pretty quickly and be in some significant fights after being released by Matchroom USA. But sort of seems like he's just sort of floating and cast adrift at the moment. Unrivaled Boxing Talk and News says, thank you for the super chat, appreciate that. He says, robbery equals views, that's why I said it's close fight, to be fair. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't saying that you were throwing the word around robbery. I mean, I think just in general, there's a lot of people, if it's a close fight, even 7-5, and you're kind of like, well, it can go either way, you see a lot of people saying, it's a robbery. Like, I didn't think Katie Taylor and Delphine Persoon was a robbery, but I thought it was a really close fight, but I thought Persoon won. I mean, if it was 8-2, something like that, and it was clear. I mean, we've had examples more recently, and as I said earlier, that Rolly Romero fight, I haven't seen it, but from what everyone says, and obviously the scorecards were outrageous. I think one judge had it 10 rounds to 2, where it could have been the other way around. And Rob says he is sick of the term robbery. So we're an hour and 40 into the stream, so I think we'll wrap it up in a couple of minutes. Earlier, sort of before I got onto the stream, I had a 3-hour sleep, so yeah, sort of hay fever has been a bit knocked around this week, but I try to go out for a walk every day, so my window on that for the day is closing because it's 10 p.m. here now, so we'll go for another 5 minutes or so. So if you've got some comments or questions, get them in the chat quickly, and we will whip through them, and we'll wrap up in another 5 minutes or so. And if you could help me out, smash the like button on the way in or the way out, that would be much appreciated. So liberalism is a cult, says he double-checked. Whtte said 248, so I didn't think he'd lose too much weight where loss of power is a concern. Well, the 240s, the mid-240s to 250s, a good weight for him. It has been in the past. So I sort of thought somewhere maybe around the mid-240s, 245, but based on what the photos we saw earlier this week, I wouldn't have been surprised if it was a 239 or something like that, or early 240s. But yeah, with it, fight week and tapering, he might just put on a few extra pounds, keep the energy and that sort of stuff. He doesn't have to, boil himself down. I mean, I remember Adam Kovnatsky admitting after which fight was it? I think it was the Areola fight, where he got criticism, and he actually responded to me and said he boiled down for that fight for the scale and lost 10 pounds of water weight in the day before the fight, which I think if you've put the work in camp, you would never have to do that. I think Sergey Kuzmin does that for weigh-ins too, because sometimes he looks in pretty good shape and the next day he's like muffin topping over his shorts and stuff. Big Simpson says robbery is used too much these days. Triple G versus Canelo, I watched back, was no robbery. Well, the first fight, I thought that Triple G won that 7-5, and then I thought second fight Canelo won that one. I thought that was a 7-5 or 8-4, something like that. Big Simpson says Adelaide Bird scorecard was not correct though. No, not for that. What was that, 118, 110? That was ridiculous. John says the only recent robbery was Rolly versus Marines. AZ says Hunter lost the plot recently, must have been punched in the head too many times. Angel says Povetkin is a class fighter, has a very good resume. Yeah, I mean, this is 2 top 10 fighters. Sure, Povetkin is older, he is faded. I'm not going to have anyone tell me that he's still in his prime. I mean, we have to be realistic with these guys. This is a fight that Whtte has taken because he thinks he can win, because Povetkin is not as good as he once was. But it's still a good name, it's still a good win, it's a good money fight, it's a prize fighter. These things factor in here. Joshua says, do you think Keith Thurman will get the ring anytime soon? Him asking for 10 million for Bud Crawford is deplorable. Yeah, well, 10 million he's not going to get that. But if he got 10 million, what would Crawford get? Donovan says, good morning from the US. Are we able to watch the fight here? Which one? The Whtte one? That is on DAZN, definitely. And it's actually, and if you're in New Zealand, because I've had a couple of questions, that's going to be on Spark Sport via pay-per-view. But if you have been doing some of that DAZN testing, you'll get it for free on DAZN. So even though some of the testing is paused, you do, if you're one of the beta testers, and this is probably the same in other countries too, where you've been doing those the testing and all that sort of stuff, you will be able to get access through DAZN, because once you enter that code to do the testing, you got 2 months access. So yeah, I'm glad that I don't have to part with $30 for it. That may have affected the way that I felt towards paying for it, but yeah. So Kevin says Wilder is a fighter with a padded record, and all he can do is punch. He hadn't fought any of the top names, was found out by the first in the form of world level fighter. Angel says he had Povetkin 7-5 in the Hunter fight, but could see why people may have seen a draw. Yeah, I mean, I could see that, or I could have seen it the other way. But obviously, if Povetkin had got that knockdown that wasn't called, that may have altered the scorecards and given him the win there. Big Simpson says even Katie versus Bassoon was not a huge robbery, it was close. John says, I would like to see Dillian closer to 240 pounds as his gas tank never looked good. Yeah, I mean, I think he is one of these fighters, and there's a number of them in the heavyweight division. They don't work, for all 3 minutes of a round. And if Dillian Whtte chooses to do that against Povetkin, and he may for some of the earlier rounds, he may try to really sort of put Povetkin under pressure, because people forget Povetkin, he'll like to dictate the pace and how the fight's going. He doesn't work in, consistently in a round. He'll just operate in bursts, and he'll work when he wants to, as opposed to, pushing the action. So if Dillian Whtte can make it uncomfortable, it'd be interesting to see how his gas tank is looking in the second half of the fight, but also Povetkin's, because Povetkin sometimes gets that second half of the fight, like in the Huey Fury fight, and to an extent the Hunter fight, it's kind of like he's cruising because he can't step it up anymore because, his gas tank is running low. And Easy says Whtte will come in at 252. I think it'll be a bit less. Big Simpson says, is Higgins in any talks with Junior Farr for the Parker fight? Yes, he is, and you can hear the latest on that, or from earlier the week, I did an interview with him on the channel. So Higgins spoke to me for about 10 minutes. He's probably the most concise that I've ever, with Higgins in an interview. Sometimes you can just ask one question, he'll go on for 5 minutes, but he actually made me work a bit more and ask a few more questions. So that is up on the channel, do check it out. Unrivaled says, training in the Portuguese sun has made Dillian look fantastic. The pick is the best shape I've seen him since the first drug suspension. The other thing I would, the question, and this is like a hindsight 2020 question, he was out there for like 6 or 7 months or whatever it was. It was a long time. Is there a question of overtraining? And if he does sort of end up gassing out a bit, or maybe looking a little bit off the boil, that question might be asked after the fight. Unger says Higgins is talking with Ludabella to make the fight. And interestingly, and I mentioned this earlier in the stream, after Ludabella said, stop talking David Higgins, stop talking to the media, after that tweet came out. Kevin says, why isn't Parker fighting anyone of any note? Good question. They're looking to have this fight in New Zealand outside of his current contract. Some of this, it looks like it's to help out David Higgins and, his company, which probably needs the cash flow. But they're sort of saying the pandemic. But if other fighters can get exemptions to fight elsewhere, why can't Parker? I think that makes a lot of sense. Jambo says the beta testing in the UK has been excellent. Be interesting to see if DAZN do this worldwide launch, and it seems they will. what impact will that have in certain markets, with boxing content where it's going to be. Because, say, where I am, and I'm sure where you are, certain different channels have had different cards, and that will obviously disappear. Angel says, what's Lucas Brown's current situation? Well, it seems like they're waiting for the Whtte Dubois fight for that to be rescheduled. They've spoken about that, him and his manager Matt Clark, so we'll see. Richard says, Gutta saying Povetkin. Actually, that seems to be this week. I've seen a lot of people saying out, well, actually, Alexander Povetkin might be able to do this. Big Simpson says, thanks, Del. I'll go watch the interview. Angel says, I think it's going to be a draw, Povetkin versus Whtte. Let's hope not. Let's hope not. Hopefully there's a conclusive result either way. Maybe May says, all right, got to go. Thanks for the awesome content. And on that note, I will wrap up the stream. So we're almost 1 hour 50 into it, but 77 in the building. Thank you wherever you are, morning, noon, or night. Smash the like button on the way out if you could, please. That would appreciate that. If you want more Boxing Squared content, there is patreon.com/boxing squared from as little as $1 a month. And if you do want to check out my new channel, which is called Amazing New Zealand, that is one video, sort of fishing, camping, outdoors type stuff, one video a week. So thank you for being part of another stream, and